So this will probably be a pretty quick video. I wanted to talk about how I use the terms Stolon, Rhizome, and Runner. So those terms I don't always use completely accurately. And it can kind of be difficult to establish what those things actually are because there is overlap there, especially with runners. Now runners we're going to separate out first. Now a runner refers to both stolons and rhizomes, so we're going to separate that out first. It is any sort of plant material, propagatable plant material, that will go beyond the plant, coming off of the plant, and make clones of that plant. So that can also apply to things like plants that tend to have a drooping structure that will then root and grow a new plant right there. But then that brings us back to stolons and rhizomes. Now there is a distinctive difference there, but again, there's a lot of overlap. So I actually have a few plants right here that we can look at. The first one I want to look at is this Mentha aquatica. So this has both what I would just refer to as a runner typically, and you can kind of see that there. That is technically rhizomatous tissue. It's a hard word for me to say. So you can see that that is just a stem, and you can kind of see there's a little bit of a plant starting to form there, and that's what you'll typically find with menthas. But any of these stems could droop and hit the ground and set roots into the dirt and create a larger population of plants by creating more plants, essentially. And I'll kind of give you a better look at just the variable structure of this, and you can see a lot of that with the Mentha aquatica. So that's something that's kind of in between the two, that it can be hard to define, but typically you will refer to those stems that I showed you, these stems, you would refer to that as a rhizome in a typical botanical literature writing, whatever, because technically that is what it is. But I have another example, which is actually Mentha. It is pennyroyal here, so I believe that one is Mentha pelagium. And you can see that this is basically all entirely stems. You can see that. Now this is actually stoloniferous. These are stolons, and the way you define those is they only grow across the surface of the soil. So they are exposed to the air, they're not directly in soil. They are on top of the soil, creeping across it. So what is an actual rhizome then? Well, you can think of rhizomes as like potatoes, which are tubers. Which actually brings us into another thing that I can sometimes refer to incorrectly, specifically with Lycopus. But let's look at the Tecreum here. So I removed the Tecreum canadense from its pot, and you can see these. These are traditional rhizomes. So obviously these are green because they've escaped from the pot at this point. But this is all asexually propagatable material right here. And you can see it's basically the same thing as with the mint, except of course these are still in a dark enough place that they haven't formed leaves or anything. So that's what a rhizome is. So that's what a rhizome is. It is strictly subterranean, but sometimes with Tecreum you'll see the rhizomes actually form here and then go beneath the surface of the soil, but because they actually seek out the soil and go beneath it, that is still a rhizome. Just to kind of make sure that you actually understand what this stoloniferous habit is, it's essentially vines. So you can see that a lot with the Plectranthus there, which I talk about in a different video. But yeah, so Mentha pelagium, stoloniferous, Tecreum canadense, rhizomatous, and Mentha aquatica. That's somewhere in between the two. It can have both the stoloniferous form and the rhizomatous form with that there. And that's how you can kind of tell the difference on Mentha aquatica specifically. It's just a really good example because it gives you something with all three of those forms. Now, I did mention Lycopus, which is actually kind of an outlier. Usually I will refer to them as having tubers, but what they actually have is rhizomes. So let's take a look at that. Now, Lycopus is also unique because it has a combination of the two, and it's actually not determinate on very much. So these are the stolons, these fragile little hair-like things. These are stolons, and they go across the surface of the soil, and they do the same thing and propagate more plants and create the same population growth. Not very much different than a rhizome, as I said. But it is very distinctly different from the actual rhizomes of the Lycopus, and we can take a look at those right now. Now here is the tuber. I would do air quotes, but I'm holding two things. The tuber of this plant. You can see that that's kind of similar to what you saw with the Mentha aquatica. And it can actually be pretty difficult to find the rhizome of it, but you can kind of see the swollen stem there. So typically when you'll see the actual rhizomes of this plant, it will be a much thicker stem than you will with the stolons of this plant, which are above ground versus subterranean. Now I'm sure there's a bunch of adaptable benefits to that. This is both a swamp and riparian zone plant, so I see a lot of the stoloniferous habit in the riparian zone. I gotta enunciate that one, in the riparian zone of habit. But I would assume in the swamps, more often than not, because there's a lot more competition, they would have the subterranean habit. But another interesting thing is this stoloniferous habit can actually become the rhizomatous habit, as you can see here, where there's a tuber and maybe even a little one there, but that actually looks like it could be a little plant. So that had just enough moisture that this decided it was going to form a tuber outside of that. Now if this was on the surface of the soil, this would probably root in at one of these here and probably grow another plant that would form tubers. But that's just kind of an interesting thing about it. Just another good example of something that has both habits and very distinctive habits compared to the Mentha aquatica, which is just happenstance. Well, as a typical outro for the video, I'd just like to thank you for watching and say, leave a comment if you actually thought this was helpful. I just really wanted to clear up some things, and if there's any other botanical terms that I might be able to explain, make sure you tell me about them too. And if there's anything you're doing cool in the fall, I'd love to hear about that, especially with plants. It can be a hard time for a lot of gardeners, native plant people even though there's always something to do with native plants. So just thank you for watching.